Hi. Today I'm going to make some springtime napkins while I tell you a personal story with a twist at the end about when I immigrated from Brazil to a new foreign land abroad. Stay put. I bet you won't see the end coming, just like I didn't at the time. Chapter 1. In the beginning, I was a princess. We begin when my mom, my brother, and I walked the narrow fence-lined path along the house till we reached a little door that was too short to pass through without stooping. My mom opened it, and I was immediately confused when I saw the cement steps leading down towards a dirt landing. I had never seen a basement before. This was 3 days after my 10th birthday, on June 6th, 1997, and by August of the same year, I got properly dressed to go to London and rub shoulders with royalty, which didn't surprise me in the least. After all, I had spent my entire childhood being told by my father that I would grow up to be a princess. The way he spoke of it made me certain that I would one day catch the eye of a prince, just like in the storybooks. And since Brazil had just ended a dictatorship shortly before my conception and had no monarchy, naturally, the best place for me to fulfill my royal destiny was England. And the reason I was there now was because 11 months prior, my mother promised my father on his deathbed that I would learn English and get the European education he had provided my much older brothers, but not yet me. 6 months after leaving his mortal body behind, my mother left me and my youngest brother in the care of my grandmother to embark on an international journey to build for us a better life in a new and foreign land. 3 months after her, it was mine and my brother's turn to get on a plane, leaving all we ever knew behind for a land of promise, culture, and history. We were escorted by the mother of a family friend. She was an almost stranger to us both, and was mostly disinterested in us. Her presence was really only necessary for legal purposes of travel. I arrived at the airport with more expectation than I had luggage. Finally, I was going to begin the life I had so long waited and prepared for. Though I had left everything I had ever had behind, I carried with me the only things that could not be taken from me: knowledge and memories. I have left behind hundreds of books in several languages. My father was an old German man addicted to the written word. And every time he visited Germany, he would bring back books, marzipan, chocolates, and wooden toys. Every holiday, I was gifted more books. And if we went out together, you guessed it, we'd get more books. My father and I were both artists, and all my books were covered in beautiful illustrations. In the 1980s and 90s, TV culture was very different from today, especially in Ubatuba, where I'm from. TVs were expensive and very much for grown-ups. And for those who had them, they were used for 3 purposes: football, news, and novellas. Children would usually only get to watch cartoons on the weekends. So I entertained myself with drawing, painting, and my books. I would get lost in the illustrations, imagining myself inside the little animal homes underground, or inside the trees, or among old little German villages with their cobblestone streets and quaint wooden bridges that led into magical forests, dappled with sunlight and confettied with flowers. Any time my father would read a story with a female protagonist, or a princess, he would switch their name to mine. Perhaps now you understand how growing up without the cynicisms of TV shows, the vast knowledge inside the internet, or the trends on TikTok, and instead, being raised among colorful storybook pages in a little beach town in Brazil, late to modernity, it was easy to believe that such a fairy tale life was possible for me. Further enforcing this belief was the fact that among an army of older and younger brothers, I was my father's only daughter, and the only girl of my generation of cousins on my mother's side of the family. And because of this, I was very much made to believe that I was one of the most beautiful and special little girls in the world. Of course, I would grow up to be a princess, but to do that, I would have to go to Europe. Chapter 2. If this was a book, it would have been an old, wet newspaper. When I arrived to this new English-speaking country, I knew I was here to fulfill my royal destiny. It had not turned out to be the quaint, picturesque life I had expected it to be from my books. My first red flag was when we were driving to our new home from the airport. There were no cute historical buildings, no flowers on the house windows, no gardens, cobblestone streets, or fruit trees. I had landed upon a world of grey, of asphalt, cement, and tall, undiscernible buildings. The streets were littered with trash and decorated only by gas stations. The air smelled of urine, stale water, cigarettes, and tailpipe. Eventually, we passed this big city into a more residential area. The houses looked more like the ones I had seen in the movie Toy Story, and this was pleasing and it gave me hope. The second red flag was when we arrived to our house and I walked to the front door while my mother helped my brother get out of the car. I was so impressed by the big 3-story house. It looked like a dollhouse, and all of my neighbors had similar houses. International phone calls in those times were wildly expensive, so the few times I did get to speak to my mom while we were apart, all she had said about where we were going to live was that it was small. Now that I saw it, I thought she was being much too modest. But then she told me the front door was not our door, and beckoned me towards the side of the house, where she opened that smaller door. We lived in the basement of that big house. The cement steps led to a dark dirt floor landing. To the left, there was another door. This one was human height. Through it was a kitchen where the majority of the floor was covered with black and white checkered linoleum. The ceilings were lined with pipes, some of them warm with hot water inside. There was an especially large one that went through our bedroom, where the 3 of us shared a queen-size mattress on the floor. And this is where we lived, in a small cave-like tunnel under a beautiful house, on a sunny street lined with other human-sized dollhouses. Now, though our reality was grim, my mother did her best to make it cozy. She bought a few decorations from the dollar store to bring some color in, and during Christmas, she even covered the doors with cheap metallic wrapping paper and bows to make them look like presents. On garbage days, she would take us out treasure hunting for furniture and toys that other people would put outside, and we were usually well dressed by the second-hand clothes given to us from her rich boss's children. But this small 2-bedroom space was not only ours. We had to share it with another Brazilian woman named Maria do Carmo. She was sturdy and burly, with a serious face that was crowned by short, dark, curly hair. It was the type of face that even when she smiled warmly and laughed loud, still made her presence feel distant and unfamiliar. I knew nothing of her existence before my arrival. I had never lived with strangers before, and this made my new home seem even more foreign, and me out of place. Chapter 3. The Babysitter and the Psycho Preacher. We had arrived on a Friday, and my mom had to return to work as a nanny and maid on Monday. So my brother and I had to stay with the wife and kids of the psycho preacher that lived on the second floor of the same house. It was there that I got my first glimpse of how everyone was living above me, and I felt deeply underprivileged for the first time in my decade of life. The rooms were large, the floors wooden, and the windows were plentiful and breezy in the summer heat. It created a depressing contrast at first, to have to descend to our low-ceilinged quarters in the evenings, and our 2 miniature windows that looked out to the cracked pavement and the bottom of the house next door. But after having met her husband, the preacher, I was glad to do so. Though our home was small and dark, it was cozy and full of love. We ate our meals on plastic plates from McDonald's, made colorful with our favorite characters from Disney's Hercules. We drank the magical wonder that was powdered pink lemonade, which seemed like the peak of fancy in comparison to the labor of squeezing limes, as we had to do back in Brazil. And above all, we enjoyed the sweet mouth heaven of Swiss Miss, truly believing we were indulging in a handmade delicacy, elegantly crafted by our European neighbors in the Swiss Alps. Meanwhile, upstairs, our babysitter and her 2 sons were getting beat up in the name of the Christian God. She often had bruises on her face, and the weight of oppression slowed down her voice. Her name was Luigi, and they were all Brazilian too. Because her husband was such a worthless and lowly creature, I never bothered my brain to carry the burden of remembering his name. After all, who names a cockroach? A vermin. And every one of our neighbors and friends only referred to him as Luigi's husband, her humanity and worth as a person being the only one recognized in their partnership. And she only called him my husband. If he had the brains to comprehend this, I bet he wouldn't have approved of being referred by his community only as her possession, or otherwise too insignificant to be named at all. He was a short, thin waif of a being, greasy-haired and pale in a way that only creatures from the darkness of caves or subterranean existence can be. When he would come home from work with his spitty teeth and his mouth full of rage, he would try to honey up syrupy explanations to my brother and I about how he was angry at his sons, not us, and how we didn't need to be afraid of him. It always irritated me that he thought himself so mighty as to incite fear within me. Such a slimy, slick-haired, beady-eyed little man that he was, he clearly had no idea that I was no Christian and had very much been told to always fight with teeth, nails, and make any object within reach my weapon if ever violence came upon me. Alas, he never bothered my brother or I, as we spent that summer with Luigi and her sons, Michael and Kevin, in the dismal public parks, and the grey libraries full of books that I could not read, and in front of the TV, watching Sesame Street as they tried without avail to teach me English. Chapter 4. Not all is as it seems. Finally came the weekend where my mom said, "Today we have to go to London." But she said this in Portuguese and without ceremony. And in Brazilian Portuguese, especially in our specific Caipira dialect, we have a penchant for taking verbal shortcuts. We chop words to pieces and sometimes skip over the last letters, especially the S that makes things plural. So when she said the Portuguese word for London as Londres instead of Londres, I didn't think much of it. Now this is important to remember for the rest of the story. So I was giddy with excitement and immediately started putting on my best clothes. This consisted of a colorful striped shirt and my favorite jean overalls. Before leaving Brazil, my grandmom had sewn on some very exciting buttons, shaped like ice creams, apples, color pencils, leaves, and other fun non-circular button shapes. I was living the dream. Finally, I would be among royalty, history, castles, and in the European pages I had seen in my storybooks. I wondered which ancient building would be my school, and what kind of uniform I would wear. In Brazil, most public schools had uniforms, and I could imagine that wouldn't be any different here. I was beaming. So when my mom asked if I was ready to go to Londres, without the S, I jumped up and down with a smiling yes. We got in the car and started to drive. I would look out the window ready to see the residential neighborhood turn into castles and the asphalt into cobblestone streets. I kept my eyes alert to find the red double-decker buses, but the houses just became buildings, each taller than the last, all of them gray and unkempt. Turning the landscape dark and dismal, the streets became dirtier, and all the buses looked regular. My mom parked the car on a busy street. As she was opening the car door, she smiled back at me and told me to grab my book, because I always had one with me. This puzzled me. When she stopped here, I thought maybe she had to run a quick errand before London. But what could take so long that it warranted my book? After getting my brother out of the car, she went to the trunk and pulled out a huge bag of dirty laundry. Now I was properly puzzled. Seeing my face, she explained, "I usually wash them at work, but this week I didn't have the time." I finally spoke up and said, "Mom, I thought we were going to Londres." And she said, "Yeah, we're here." Pointing to the sign above the scratched, murky windows behind me, she read the dirty old letters slowly. Laundry. Laundry. She was just saying laundry in her heavy Brazilian accent. "This is where we wash clothes. Laundry," she repeated, pleased with her newfound English knowledge. Words and pronunciations aside, laundromats were a completely foreign concept to me. I had heard of washing machines but had never seen one in person, much less an entire place full of them for public use. In Brazil, we washed everything by hand, so I explained to her my confusion. "I thought we were in England, in Europe." With much pity, she explained that no, we were in the Bronx, New York, in the United States, and that we lived nearby in Mount Vernon. Now here's the root of my confusion. Aside from my ignorance of geography at the age of 10, I was still a decade and a half from being diagnosed with dyslexia. In Portuguese, we call the United States Estados Unidos, and we abbreviate it as EU. And the European Union is called União Europeia, abbreviated as UE. So I thought in my baby dyslexic brain that they were somehow one and the same. As for United States and United Kingdom, to me they were just different ways of saying the same thing. Also confusing me was that I thought that Inglês was only spoken in Inglaterra. So for 3 months, I lived in Mount Vernon, New York, thinking I was living somewhere in England. And that's the end of my coming to America story, folks. If you're still here, thank you for your finite mortal time. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more of my weird stories and anecdotes, comment below. And if you want the pattern and the video instructions to make your own napkins like the ones here in the video, check out my Patreon. Links below. See y'all next time. Ha det!